No spoilers. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is one of the best games ever made. Developers across the industry have tried and largely failed for the better part of a decade to even come close to following the path that game paved. That is until the very same dev team took it upon themselves to move the goalpost in the best way possible with what I will say without a shred of doubt is the best sequel of all time, The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. And I have receipts breaking down every reason why this game has set what should be the gold standard to sequels in the video game industry, or at least, once they catch up to that initial release problem. Let's talk about it. Gamers at large are pretty limited in what they tend to want in a sequel. It's almost always as simple as more of the same, but prettier, longer, more feature-packed. I'm sure you're familiar with this sort of feeds and speeds approach, and yes, Tears of the Kingdom emphatically passes every single one of these parameters with flying colors. And as it should, of course those things all contribute to what makes a good sequel and ultimately does contribute to the point I'm attempting to make here. But the best thing about this game in particular is, unlike the vast majority of follow-ups to games with massive fan bases, when in regards to another common expectation of sequels to massive successful games, is that they better fix whatever thing that didn't work the last time around. Tears of the Kingdom, that game, ignores this last bullet point. No, that's a lie. It acknowledges that request and responds in kind with a nice big "F off, we know how to make games better than you do." I say that because by and large, the improvements made to Tears of the Kingdom by way of Breath of the Wild were not only made without caving to fan outrage, many of them were made in spite of those critiques. Now, on face value, this sounds like a strategy that can end in a product steeped in contrarianism, which I hate. Nothing worse than an edgy sales pitch. But in practice, it comes off to me like a seasoned team of game developers confidently proclaiming that they know what they are doing and insisting that they believe wholeheartedly in their original vision. And with good reason. We are talking about a game that to this day has game devs the world over salivating and racking their brains on how it was made. I would take that as the go-ahead to feel the same way if I were them. All of that said, let's get into those changes. A good place to start here is what inspired this video pretty early on in my Tears of the Kingdom playthrough, and it's fitting as it's easily the most prevalent Breath of the Wild complaint: weapon durability. It's pretty self-explanatory. Weapons break in Breath of the Wild. Weapons haven't traditionally broken in past games in the series. In fairness, weapons don't traditionally break in action games at large, so it's not like the complaint comes as a surprise. A big part of the way gamers interact with this medium stems from familiarity and comfort. It's why most controllers have the same form factor, it's why most games use the same jump button, and so many other examples that we can rattle off forever. Despite that, the weapon degradation system from Breath of the Wild has returned. That said, these complaints didn't go completely ignored by the dev team, as will be the trend here for most of these changes. Rather than removing anything, the solution was to include possible workarounds to the problem. What was immediately apparent to me was that the Zelda dev team disagreed with this take, because not only did they bring the feature back, they made it a central theme of the plot that weapons across Hyrule have been corrupted by Ganondorf, and as a result, they are not only on average less durable, they also do less damage. I personally believe this was a brilliant change, because at the end of the day, weapon durability has a distinct purpose, being to encourage and at times force creative and/or flexible approaches to combat. That facilitated the flow of Breath of the Wild for those who embraced it, and now with Tears of the Kingdom, it thrusts that original intent on players that resisted this push for creativity in combat in the previous title. The core of these games is all about challenging complacency. Nintendo created Breath of the Wild as a result of a 30-year-long over-reliance on the comfort that was the Zelda formula that has largely gone completely unchanged since the day the series began. Weapons specifically represent this comfort better than anything else in the game. People hate the weapons breaking because they want the reliability of having a main weapon that they feel comfortable using and typically can do high damage with. To the dismay of these Zelda purists, unlike the games of old, this new direction for Zelda is much more informed by survival games. You are meant to find your footing on the fly, just like Zelda, who, yes, of course, is the boy, is forced to after once again awakening from the aftermath of a traumatic experience. Tears of the Kingdom's approach of challenging complacency, the standard standard of receiving the sword from the old man that you will use for the vast majority of the game until you get an even better sword that you can then use for the rest of the game doesn't exactly align. However, they do allow for players to find some level of comfort with specific weapons by way of Tears of the Kingdom's fuse mechanic, which makes it possible to turn any weapon into a different version of itself, be it one that lasts longer, hits harder, sports an elemental attribute of some sort, or gives it some sort of unique effect not possible otherwise. Unlike the sole use of weapon durability alone as a mechanic, this solution forces people to make those sort of survival game inspired decisions. You won't often simply be handed a weapon like the ones people have a propensity to over-rely on. You will either have to form the active thought to experiment and try to create them, or in some, albeit rarer instances, steal them from an enemy out in the world, which in and of itself will require some level of craftiness from the player, assuming they don't already have a preferred weapon to combat their foe. Tears of the Kingdom's dev team choosing to improve on their past choices with a system like this not only maintains their mission statement from their prior outing, it expands on it as there are now even more potential outcomes of any given situation, and once people do start to find those comfortable go-to solutions, they at least have a higher likelihood of being unique to each player, which at the end of the day is a goal that permeates throughout many, if not every other aspect of the game. In fact, climbing in Breath of the Wild was one of, if not the most iconic aspects of the game. No game before it afforded the same level of freedom while also simultaneously turning every inch climbed into an emergent puzzle game in its own right. On the whole, people at large appreciate or even love the way Nintendo approached this feature, but two areas where there are some pushback was stamina, which some, and I want to stress some in comparison to the next point, people found the stamina requirement to be a frustrating aspect of this mechanic. And the second, far more ubiquitous complaint is how climbing interfaces with rain. Personally, I always looked at both of these things as a part of the puzzle game approach to climbing in Breath of the Wild. The feature is touted as a means to go anywhere in the game, but I think it's a lot more accurate to take that as a challenge rather than a guarantee. Tears of the Kingdom, for the most part, seems to double down on this because obviously stamina is largely unchanged and rain is back, and still causes Zelda, the boy, to slip. What does change though is your options when attempting to reach the peak of any given climb. We're crossing streams a bit as far as the intended structure of this video is concerned because, spoilers, I'll be diving into abilities next, and I would prefer to go in the order that they are useful as far as quantity is concerned, but Ascend is the biggest boon in regards to climbing in this game, so we're going to rip the band-aid off here. Having a hard time climbing a particularly steep part of the world in rain? No problem. Find a ledge or stone or sky island debris to ascend through and circumvent the climb altogether. None of those things in sight? Good news. You can use a floating stone zonai device or two or several to make one yourself. That not enough? Recall can easily be your saving grace as you can create a makeshift elevator from any ultra-handable surface you can get your hands on, or you can find a falling sky island piece to yeet yourself far above the summit and glide back down. And the options don't stop there. With the combination of Tears of the Kingdom's Ultra Hand abilities and zonai devices to boot, there's not much, if anything, you can't do in general, let alone climbing. Sheikah runes were one of, if not the most important piece to the puzzle that is Breath of the Wild when it comes to enabling its gameplay and overall structure. Despite that, they were ostensibly shot into the sun for Tears of the Kingdom because they are nowhere to be seen here, and their place stands, or floats, kinda, Ultra Hand. The dev team revealed that the inspiration for the Ultra Hand abilities came from watching Breath of the Wild speedruns and witnessing the lengths people went to jerry-rig impromptu vehicles and devices to traverse the world. After seeing the creativity people demonstrated with these ideas, the team behind this game decided to open the floodgates and allow for creativity on a level that, to put it lightly, puts Breath of the Wild to shame by comparison. People are quite literally engineering some insane creations to do any number of things, and you don't even need to actually have a creative bone in your body if that's not your thing. Auto build affords more traditional fans that prefer more of a lock and key approach the option to auto generate pre-made, more conventional creations to get through the parts of the game that insist on building things to solve a puzzle and or clear an obstacle. All of that said, although Ultra Hand and by extension Auto Build in a vacuum would be enough to demonstrably evolve what's possible with everything from traversal to puzzle solving to combat, they went and added even more abilities that do their fair share of envelope pushing. I touched on Fuse a little bit earlier, but for the sake of going through the new abilities in one spot, in addition to being able to scale weapons to insane levels of pure damage, you can literally reproduce the Cryonis ability from Breath of the Wild, create makeshift elemental rods, bounce enemies several yards away from you, and so much more that I have yet to experience in my time with the game. I'd be lying if I said I didn't initially miss the comfort of the Sheikah runes, specifically the infinite supply of bombs. I will say I've grown to greatly prefer Tears of the Kingdom set of abilities, and that's without even scratching the surface of this game's champion ability, so as not to spoil that for people still taking their time with the game, or maybe even have yet to play at all. On the topic of not spoiling, we gotta talk about the story, or at least its quality, or largely purported lack thereof. I am a strong proponent of the take that video game stories at large are mid amongst the larger wide world of storytelling. I say this not to set up this video as a vehicle for that conversation, but rather as a means to contextualize my feelings on the way Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild before it approaches storytelling. I don't think it's good, but I do think it works better than fans of traditional Zelda give it credit for. To clarify, I think both of these games are relatively, I don't want to use the word lazy because it's a trite, ironically lazy way to criticize something as complex and daunting as AAA game development, but let's call it lax in its solution to the openness and resulting unpredictability of each individual person's path through the story and thereby the needed delivery cadence of that material. However, I much prefer they try to make a story that facilitates a more unique gameplay experience that could use further trial and error than to settle for the actually lazy solution that would have been essentially aping the medium of film by showcasing a series of cutscenes at linear predetermined points. In other words, taking the if it ain't broke don't fix it approach for a go-to option that never truly works for the medium. And to be all the way real, the way Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild tell their stories are not a bad path, they just aren't complete enough to fulfill the promise of truly open storytelling. That doesn't mean that future titles can't at least feel complete where these fell flat. It hopefully just means future attempts can learn an important lesson from them. Namely, they need to do a way better job at reflecting what you've done in the cutscenes you see in the order you personally discover them. They even do a bit of this in both games. Characters know if you solved a problem they were meant to shepherd you through before they were given the chance. They know whether you found the Master Sword or not. We need for them to go further by extending what variables they account for, even if those variables only go as far as referencing or even skipping over retreading information covered elsewhere, i.e. if I already learned where Girl Zelda is in a previous, relative to my playthrough cutscene, dialogue should reflect that. And while I'm on the derailed track of pointing out weak points in a game that I firmly believe is a masterpiece, this next point is the biggest chink in its armor, because while I acknowledge the story could have been better executed, I contend what we got in that regard is still ultimately better than the rest of the franchise for how much better it is at facilitating the most important part of a video game, you know, the gameplay. But I digress. This here is the sole reason that tiny little itty bitty almost was plopped right before the word perfect in this video's title. It's also, serendipitously enough, the one place I feel the developers caved to community pressure. Dungeons, or temples, or whatever you want to call them, are one of the few things I think stray from the core design principles that made Breath of the Wild as good as it is. And again, let's be all the way real, the breath of fresh air the series desperately needed to reach its potential as one of Nintendo's most recognizable. But temples are a Zelda staple, you may be thinking. There's no way they could possibly be a hindrance, right? They can, and in this game in particular, they are. By the Zelda dev team's own admission, puzzle solving in these new games was deconstructed to account for the fact that when designing a puzzle, awarding solutions are solutions that feel unique to the player. Traditionally, Zelda dungeons were created using a series of locks and keys. This meant that with very minor exceptions, there was one way to complete a puzzle. Some argue this is the more challenging approach. I'd say something that has a linear one-size-fits-all explanation to complete isn't exactly challenging unless you count the mental fortitude required in trudging through the tedium of the stringent process that essentially amounts to talk to this guy so you can go to this place, so you can get into this door, so you can get this thing, so you can beat this monster or monsters, so you can get the MacGuffin to move on and do it all over again somewhere else. I personally find it a lot more satisfying when all of these steps are negotiable to some degree, and the way you complete them can vary wildly. Just within my sample size of players that I compared playthroughs with, be it during streams on our Twitch channel or just in casual conversations about the game, no one playthrough was the same, and in many cases the approach to puzzle solving was entirely different. Some people make it a point to find the intended solution, while I personally find it way more satisfying to find ways to skirt past those intended solutions entirely, and there's a lot of gray area in between those two philosophies. Of course, there's some good in the traditional approach to dungeons, and sure, that's largely why they return here after pivoting away from them in the previous outing. The theming of the temples varying superficially makes the experience feel grander, and while I personally don't buy the boss design critiques some had for Breath of the Wild, I will say there is potential in having such disparate approaches to those as well, but it's not realized here. I could honestly make an entire video around the highs and lows of each approach and how I feel they could best marry the two. In fact, I will definitely make that video if this one gets 500 likes before our next video essay comes out. If it does, it'll be linked here for any future viewers. If it's not, and you're disappointed by that, leave a comment wagging your finger at past viewers for this video. For now though, if it wasn't obvious, Tears of the Kingdom did not succeed in finding that balance, in my opinion. That said, back on track with what this game does excel at, even compared to Breath of the Wild, for the most part, are the puzzles, and to be more specific, the shrine design, in my opinion, improved. It's not exactly night and day, but what they did to differentiate them in this game, in my opinion, at least given the amount that I've played through to date, have been a lot more consistently fun and or interesting. Just to put that into perspective, for a large portion of this game, I would routinely dread playing through new shrines as I found them in the world, solely based on the impression a notable amount of Breath of the Wild shrines left on me, be it a needlessly frustrating shrine like the infamous motion control trials or the endlessly tedious test of strength. I, at least at the time of recording, have yet to find one shrine that justified those feelings of dread. I've walked out of every single one feeling happy that I decided to play through them, and even the repeated themes like the Proving Grounds or the shrine rebuilding trials have resulted in some of my most enjoyable moments of my playthrough thus far. I'm sure I'll eventually find one I don't like, but so far I've either found every puzzle interesting or the game was open enough to allow me to either physics and or build my way through it, which in my opinion is an excellent use of what makes this new take on the franchise so great. If you want to support this channel, check out our Patreon to see if any of the available tiers are a good fit for you. If you want to hang out with the community, a free to join Discord server is linked in the description, alongside that and all our social media accounts. Above all, subscribe to Redirect and ring the bell to be notified when new videos go live. Okay, that's it for me. See you next video.